Hey guys, before this first story gets started, I want to go ahead and let you know that there is some animal cruelty and animal death in this first story. So if you're not comfortable with that sort of thing, you can go ahead and take a look in the comments or the description below, and there will be a timestamp for you to skip ahead to the second story. So go ahead and do that if you're not comfortable with that sort of thing. Thanks for the understanding. When I was 16, I got my first job at a local fast food restaurant. Of course, since I was in school during the day, I had to work a second shift job. I was hoping that by working, I would be able to save up some money to buy my own car. Until then, however, I had to walk home to the restaurant when I got off work. It really wasn't that bad, since the restaurant was in the town I lived in anyway. The walk was maybe a little over half an hour or so. The only bad thing about it really was that I had to walk past this lightly wooded area that always gave me the creeps. It was pretty dark as well and not fenced off, which made it even freakier to me. Both of my parents worked early in the morning, and even if they didn't, they likely wouldn't have come to pick me up anyway, since it was such a short walk. One Friday night in the middle of summer, I had just gotten out of work. It was around midnight, since the store had closed at 11 p.m. I got everything cleaned up and began my walk home. It was a really nice night out actually, as I was walking along the town street. The sky was extremely clear, and I found myself constantly looking up at the constellations. They were particularly bright tonight. I was looking forward to arriving home and taking a long shower, then maybe playing some video games before going to bed. I did begin to get a little apprehensive though, as I walked by that wooded area. It was right by a road that led away from the main town road and off to a housing area that I lived in. It wasn't even that far to go really. It bugged me though because there were no street lamps at all in that area. It got very dark very quickly, and I wouldn't get light again until I turned onto the next street where the houses were. I made the turn onto that dark wooded street and tried my best to pace myself as I walked along. Hurrying surely wasn't going to help me. For some reason, I found I always got a lot more frightened whenever I tried to run or hurry. Not sure why. I guess if someone saw me running, I would have been quite humiliated. 16-year-olds really shouldn't be so scared that they try to run down the street though. That's what I told myself. It wasn't like anyone would have seen me anyway being so late at night, but for some reason right now, I still felt like I was being watched. "Hey, kid!" I heard a voice off to the side of me call out. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It took everything I had in me not to just take off running down the road. Turning around though, I looked and didn't see anyone there at all. All I could see was a bunch of wooded area and trees. As I was trying to look a bit closer, a man suddenly stepped out from behind one of them. I kid you not. He was dressed exactly like a ringmaster from a circus. He was wearing a black top hat and a red jacket with white pants on. He was very neat for having just been in the woods, and he had this big smile plastered across his face. Hey there," I responded. I shuffled on my feet, not really knowing what to do. "Come over here, kid," the man called to me. "I want to show you something." I didn't really want to go anywhere near this guy. He didn't make any moves toward me, but he was really creepy. Sorry, I best be on my way home now," I told him, and started to walk a little quicker down the street. "Come on, kid, it'll only take a second. I want to show you something real cool." Now, I know that everyone reading this will just think it would have been stupid for me to not keep walking, but I'd never really been good at conflict, and I didn't know how to feel in awkward situations either. I motioned again I was just gonna walk home. Once again, the man gestured for me to come to him and indicated he really wanted to show me something. Against my better judgment, I found myself turning over towards the man. I figured if I just waited there, I could tell what he was up to without getting too close to him. He noticed that I had walked slightly towards him, and his already wide grin grew even wider. I didn't plan on going any further than this though, just close enough to see what it was he was supposedly trying to show me. I wanted to stay as far away as possible. I stopped a fair bit of the way across the street from the guy. "Come on, kid, come closer. I need to show you something." "I think you can show me from where I'm standing," I told him. I was being foolhardy, I admit, but I could still draw the line between foolhardy and completely dumb. The man looked very disappointed, but his smile only faltered a little bit. It didn't fade completely. "Alright, well, I suppose that's close enough. I'll go get it." The man walked back behind the tree line and was out of sight for a moment. I thought about just leaving while he was back there, but I just stood there, afraid to move. The man was only gone for a moment, but when he came back from behind the tree, he had something vile in his hand. It looked like he had sewn the top half of a dead chihuahua onto the bottom half of a fish, and he didn't do a good job at it either. It was covered in dried blood, and one of the dog's eyes was hanging out of its socket. The man smiled at me. "I found a Fiji mermaid." I took off and ran my butt off. I didn't stop until I got home. Rather than save it for a car, I used my money to buy a bicycle so I could ride home instead. One of the worst decisions I made in my entire life was on the commute to my college. At first, it seemed like a really good idea, as I drove 5 miles to the train station to take it into the city. I could do any last-minute studying on the train, which I took much advantage of. Once I got into the city, I'd just take the bus to school. It sucked having to get up so early to do all of this, sure, but it was worth it in the end. Or at least worth it up until the worst thing happened. My car stopped working. I didn't really know enough about cars in order to fix it. I also didn't have enough money to take it to a mechanic either. Even worse, I didn't have any family in the area that could loan me money or drive me over to the train. I was also past the point where I could drop any classes either. If I didn't find a way to get to school, I would be failing them this semester. After racking my brain about how I was going to get there, I realized I really only had one choice now. I would have to get up earlier in the morning and just walk on over to the train station. Walking 5 miles was not the biggest steel rally. I could easily do 7 at the gym on the treadmill. But walking along the side of the road where people drive along was much harder than walking or running on a treadmill in a gym. It wasn't like in class where it was just 5 miles one way. It would also be 5 miles home after school. But I didn't really have a choice now, did I? The first few days were not that bad, really. Although when I got home at night, my feet were like lead bricks in my shoes. By the time the first week came around, it was beginning to get to be too much. I had one late class on Thursday too, which meant I would be walking 5 miles in complete darkness. At least it would be somewhat easier than walking with the burning sun, I supposed. When I got out of the train that night, I set out to walk home like usual. My feet were already throbbing and sobbing before I even got out of the parking lot. There weren't many cars in the road, which I actually found to be quite a relief. It was sort of embarrassing to have to be walking home alone like that. After I'd gotten about a mile down the road, though, I was feeling pretty terrible. What seemed to be the best possible thing happened right at that moment. A black luxury car pulled off the road and onto the shoulder. The driver rolled down his window and asked me if I needed a ride. I was so happy and relieved. I, of course, accepted. He motioned for me to hop in the passenger side. I went and got in, and he had me buckle up my seatbelt before he drove off. Although I really appreciated this ride, I had to admit the whole situation was rather uncomfortable. Being in the car with someone I didn't know at all. He was actually much bigger than me too. It was not a pleasant feeling. The man asked me where I was going, and when I told him, he nodded. He asked me what I was doing walking around so late at night in the middle of nowhere. I explained my whole situation to him. He nodded. He knew where we were going and told me he had been in the area for quite a while. After this short talk, the man basically stopped talking to me altogether. He just stared straight ahead and didn't speak another word to me. It was kind of unnerving, actually. I felt like I should try to talk to him at least a little bit, considering he was doing me a really huge favor right now. but it seemed like he didn't want to have anything to do with me. Therefore, I just kept quiet and looked forward the entire rest of the ride as well. Though very short, it was dreadful. It seemed like much longer than a 4-mile drive. I lived down a road with a few other houses on it, and everyone had already gone to bed by the time the car pulled up. I pointed my house out to the man. He drove me to it, but stopped before he got to the driveway. When he pulled over, I was very eager to get out of the car and be on my way. I grabbed my book bag with my right hand and was about to get out when the man finally reacted to me. After I opened the latch, the man, who was absolutely huge, reached over with his right hand and gripped my wrist tight. He grabbed it so hard it actually started to hurt a lot. I cried out in pain. I looked over to the man, who I now saw had a completely crazed look in his eye. I asked him to please let go of me, and he just began to laugh at me. I struggled against him, and he held me very firmly in place. I was freaked out now. I wasn't sure what to do in this situation. "Please stop it," I asked the man. "The ride wasn't free, you know," was all the man said. To my horror, while he still held my wrist firmly, probably giving me bruises, he did something even more terrifying. He reached down with his left hand, and he slowly undid his fly. My eyes grew as large as plates while I watched. The guy reached into his pants. I yelled at him to stop and tried to tell him I wasn't gay, not that it mattered at all. I also tried yelling for help, but the houses on my street were so spread apart it was unlikely anyone would come to my aid. With strength much greater than mine, the man started moving my hand closer to him. I kept on trying to pull away, using every bit of strength I had. It was really starting to hurt now with how firmly he was holding me. I dreaded the idea of even having to touch this guy, but not knowing what else to do, I did the only thing I could think of. I was still trying to pull away. Part of the strength was used to keep trying to move my wrist down as well. In a flash, I shifted my force downward, along with the force he was already using to move my hand. It ended up with him slamming his own fist right into his balls so hard that he yelled and let go of my arm. I was pleased. Thankfully, I hadn't had to come into any kind of contact with him. I immediately grabbed my things and jumped out of the door and made a mad sprint to my house. As I tried to grab my keys out, I looked behind me. I saw the man struggling to get out of the car as well. Fortunately, I was able to get my keys out and get in the house before the man could get to me. I grabbed my phone and screamed that I was calling the police. He hopped in his car and took off like a bat out of hell. I breathed about 20 sighs of relief in that moment. The following day, I put up an ad on a school bulletin board advertising for a rideshare on the way home. I found one so quickly, in fact, that I kicked myself for being stupid and not having simply done that before. I had to walk by a graveyard every day to and from the train. It had never been something that bothered me before, though. Even in the fall and winter when it got dark earlier, it never bothered me. I never quite understood why it was that people were inherently scared of graveyards. I mean, technically, they're supposed to be religious places, right? I just never got it. I took the train to and from school because I went to a school in the next town over. The school was much better there, and my parents paid extra to have me go. I also made it onto the football team there as well. This meant I was usually coming home late during the fall due to practice. I'd gotten very used to walking by that graveyard each time, and as I mentioned, it never really bothered me. I was coming home from high school, a senior, when this happened. It was late one fall evening. It was already really dark outside. It was also pretty chilly too. I recall my breath even making a fine mist as it exited my mouth. I was shivering a bit because I was only wearing my leather jacket, and it wasn't really the thickest. I stopped though when I heard a voice call out, very faint and very desperate. "Help me!" I looked around because the voice seemed to be coming from inside the graveyard. That caught me completely off guard. As I looked around the graveyard, at first glance I didn't see anything. After a moment though, I saw a shadow quickly hide behind a large tomb. I didn't know what to think of it. It was October and Halloween was coming up soon. so it would make sense that other kids would be trying to pull off pranks in a graveyard. I tried to put it out of my mind a bit and kept on walking. I didn't get more than a couple of steps further though, when a very desperate "Help me!" came across the graveyard once again. I stopped walking, torn between thinking it had to be someone trying to play a prank on me and wondering if someone might be in some sort of real trouble. I'm a pretty big guy myself. I doubted any young kids would be stupid enough to try and prank me, and if it wasn't a prank and someone really was in some sort of danger, I couldn't live with myself later if I just let them be, simply because I thought it wasn't real. I looked back in that graveyard by the tomb. I didn't see anything there this time. I decided to cautiously make my way over to it, just to see if something really was going on. If it was just a prank, I figured I'd just berate those kids who were playing it. I stepped over the very small fence and made my way into that graveyard. There was at least a paved path in there, which made me pretty happy. I wasn't afraid, like I mentioned, but I did hold them in regard. I didn't want to be disrespectful and walk all over someone's grave or something. I couldn't hear the cries for help any longer, but I figured that whatever I was looking for would be coming from that tomb. It was the general area the voice had been coming from, and it was also the area I'd seen the shadow moving by. I cautiously made my way over. When I had gotten just around to the tomb area, I heard another noise further off in the graveyard. Looking in that direction, I could make out 3 distinct shadowy forms hiding amongst the graves. There wasn't really enough light to make out anything other than their shape. They were all standing behind the gravestones, peeking out at me. I was concerned at first, but all they were doing was staring at me. I have to admit it was very eerie. They didn't move at all for a while, almost like they were statues. Even with my eyes adjusted to the dark, I couldn't really make out much besides silhouettes. I waited with bated breath, trying to see if they were going to make any moves. After a few moments, even though there were 3 of them and only 1 of me, something must have convinced them to just leave, because all 3 of them took off and ran back through the graveyard. At that point, I was convinced it must just be a prank. It must have been one of those 3 people calling for help and trying to lure me further in. I shook my head at the lameness of this joke and turned to walk back to the sidewalk. When I turned around though, I noticed now that the lock on the tomb was broken. This agitated me quite a bit. Who would disrespect the dead like this? I almost walked away, but I began to worry that the sound had been coming from inside that tomb. After looking around to make sure those figures weren't going to come bum rush me or something, I cracked open the heavy door to the tomb. It was dark inside, but I could tell right away there wasn't anyone in there. What I saw though was even worse in my estimation. The coffins in the tomb had been broken open, and the bodies had been taken out and ripped to pieces. There were bones and skulls strewn across the ground of the tomb. They had been placed in some sort of circular pattern on the ground, with more parts forming a circle inside that one, and so on. I felt sick to my stomach and immediately left that tomb. For the first time since I'd entered a graveyard, I was actually a bit frightened. Now I was worried that the people I ran into might be devil worshippers. Even if they weren't, you obviously have to be pretty sick to desecrate a grave like that. I was wary on my way out of the graveyard, and the rest of the walk home had me very on edge. I was expecting to run into those 3 shadowy forms again. Who knew what they'd be up to? I had my parents call the police when I got home to report that vandalism. As far as I'm aware though, nothing ever came of it. No one was ever caught, but every time after as I walked by that graveyard on the way home, I swore I could see those 3 figures peeking out and staring at me as I walked by the graves. This just happened to me a few nights ago, and I'm still shaken up, so please bear with me. I'm a female bartender at a small cafe that doubles as a venue. During the day, we serve coffee and lunch, and at night, we have a full bar with bands, comedy shows, and the like. On this particular night, there was an open mic comedy show. Not a lot of comedians showed up, mind you, so we ended up closing up shop early, and I was just about ready to head on home. I had one patron come in and order a single beer during the comedy show. He was acting somewhat nervous, but being a female bartender, I get a lot of male customers that are shy, or don't really want to talk to women anyway, so I didn't really think too much about it. He sat down, sipped his beer, and casually watched the show. Since we'd closed up early, everyone was pretty much gone now. I wanted to lock up and clean so I could just get on home. After I escorted the last couple out of the bar and got ready to lock up the door, I saw the man from earlier walk down the back hallway and into the men's restroom. Not even a minute after I'd seen this, he burst through the door yelling in a panic. "Hurry, come back here! I need help right now!" I stood at the opposite end of the hallway and asked him what was wrong. "The toilet is overflowing. There's water all over the place. You have to help me." I could tell something was wrong right away. "It's okay, man, it happens. I'll just mop it up later. I'm trying to close up right now, so could you get out of here?" He continued to argue with me though, trying to get me to come into the bathroom with him as I stood about 20 feet down the hallway. The man ran towards me very aggressively once he got fed up and tried to grasp at my arm. "You need to come back here now," he said. I immediately put my hands out in front of me so he couldn't come any closer, and I told him he needed to leave now. He walked outside without much trouble, surprisingly, and I locked the door behind him. I checked the bathroom only to see it was completely spotless, no water on the floor at all. I flushed the toilet and the urinal just to make sure, and they were both working just fine. I started to get a bit nervous. I took my large pocket knife and clipped it to the waistband of my pants just in the worst case scenario. As I'm cleaning our espresso machine and putting toppers on the liquor bottles, I hear a faint tapping noise. I look up at the front of the store, which is one big window that had a few curtains covering it. The same man was still there, tapping on the window and waving at me, laughing like a maniac. I watched him walk over to the door and begin to tug on it. It didn't open, of course, since I'd locked it right after he left. He started to scream and slam on the glass. "Open the door! I'm gonna kill you!" Fight overcame flight at this point. I walked around the counter and about 6 feet from the door. I pulled out my knife and locked eyes with him. "I'm calling the cops, so you better get out of here." The man smiled and walked out of view of the window. At this point, all of my adrenaline just crashed. I locked myself in the office and called 911, crying, explaining I was alone and a man had just tried to lure me into the bathroom. He was still outside trying to make his way in. I waited an hour and a half for no police to show up. I had to call my boyfriend, and he drove to the shop instead. My manager watched the security cameras from home to make sure the man didn't come back. I did the night's deposit and immediately drove home, my boyfriend following behind me. My male busboy has been coming in to work with me ever since, so at least I'm not alone. The managers have also been very firm on keeping an eye on the security cameras while I'm working, so that's good at least. The police never showed up, by the way, nor did they call me back to make sure I was okay.